welcome to my very first ever podcast that I have put together for you. These are some simple notes. I just need you to take them down and have them in your literature notebook in class. So we want to talk as an introduction to literature. I'd love for you to know that there are 5 basic elements that all great literature will contain. Any movie, any short story, any novel, these elements are found in them, and how an author chooses to highlight a particular element or weave these elements together is really what makes them end up being extremely great. So here they are. The first one is setting. I know this is tiny, but I think that you can hear me. Setting is the when and the where of a story. For example, does the story take place in Kansas in 1850, or does the story take place in 2050 on Mars? There are certain plot lines that are going to be awesome on Mars that aren't particularly believable if you set them on an island in 1920. So how you choose the when and the where of your story is actually extremely important. Sometimes the author just lays out for us at the beginning what the setting is. Other times, we as a reader just have to infer what the backdrop is looking like. All right. The second element of literature is the characters. This one seems self-explanatory, of course. The characters are the people or the person that the story is about. There are main characters and there are secondary characters in almost every novel, but sometimes in short stories we only get 1 or 2 characters. Now we can look at the characters through several different lenses. One of them is the protagonist and the antagonist. The protagonist is typically our main character, the person we are tracking with in their inner circle. The antagonist is the character who comes out in opposition of the protagonist. A lot of times this is an actual human being, but sometimes it's simply a force that is out to get our protagonist. So that's one way to look at characterization. Another interesting way to look at characterization is the character static or is the character dynamic? A static character doesn't change. From the beginning of the story to the end of the story, they are the same person. This could be good or bad. Sometimes characters that are noble, we want them to stay the same. We are fighting for them to keep their integrity. Other times, a character who is evil at the beginning, we are dying for them to learn a lesson through the course of the events of the novel, and they don't. And that keeps them static. They don't learn anything, and so they remain the same. In contrast to that, you have a dynamic character. A dynamic character changes throughout the course of our reading, right? They learn a lesson, they have a deeper understanding of something, but in some way they change. Right? The third element of literature is the sequence of events. Right? Every piece of work that is enjoyable to read has a beginning, a middle, and an end. We call that the rising action, the climax, and the falling action. During the rising action, I don't know if I can do this backwards, we have the problem, it's laid out and it's building. It's getting worse, it's getting more imperative that we solve it. The climax is when it comes to the peak of the crisis and something has to give. And then the falling action is, as a result of the crisis, what is our resolution? Okay? Now, you'll know when you are reading something or listening to something that isn't as intriguing when it's not tracking with the idea of the beginning, middle, and end. If you've ever listened to a younger sibling or a cousin who's maybe 3 or 4 and they're just telling a story, but there's no problem and there's definitely no solution, they're just describing unicorns in the clouds or whatever it is, and you're thinking, come on, get to the good part. That's because they haven't quite mastered that every story has a beginning, a middle, and an end. All right? Now, the fourth element of literature, I'm just going to write this up here for you, is conflict. Okay, every story has to have a problem. It can't have a beginning, middle, and an end if there is no problem. All right, there are 4 main types of conflict. The first one is man versus man, and that is simply there are two characters or two groups of characters who are in conflict. All right? The second one is man versus self. This happens when we are having an inner struggle, or the main character is struggling inside of their head. Can I be brave when I'm not a brave person? Will I make the right choice? Because I'm wrestling with what I want versus what I should do. Okay? The third kind is man versus nature. If you've ever read anything by Jack London, he's excellent at this. Can you lose your way in a snowstorm and survive? How many days can I be on a deserted island and survive, again, versus the elements of nature? And then the fourth one is man versus society. And that's man versus an idea, a tradition, something that is a force against him, but it's not necessarily a person. It could simply be a way of life or a way of thinking. All right. Now there are other types of conflict. One that I can think of is man versus the supernatural. They're just a little less common, and I just wanted you to have the main four. But know that there are others out there. You could read something that doesn't necessarily fit into one of these four categories. And finally, the fifth element of literature is the theme. The theme is the central idea of a story. And sometimes people get theme and plot confused. The difference is that the plot is just the actual events we know about in the story, what happens. But the theme makes us ask, what does it mean? Okay? When you read a novel, and at the end, we want to know that there was some sort of experience shared, that there was a truth that was displayed through characters' lives. And that is what makes literature so very powerful. When an author can weave his setting with well-developed characters that we either relate to or we can't stand, and then he gives them good action in the plot and a conflict that we're engaged with, it's really almost impossible not to learn something from reading it. And that would be where the theme comes into play. What does the author want us to learn? And sometimes it's actually entertaining when we're reading things with a theme we don't agree with. The author may be trying to make a point, but we don't appreciate his point, which is kind of an interesting way. But all authors are writing with a purpose, and that would definitely come out in the theme. So there you go, the 5 elements of literature. They're setting, character, plot, conflict, and theme. And I hope you got those down in your notes.